My name's John Shakow. I'm a partner at King Spalding, an international law firm. I'm part of the FDA and life sciences practice. The history of AMP is a long and sordid one in many respects. I mean, of course, it came into being back in 1991. It, for many, many years, had no regulatory instruction on how to calculate average manufacturer price, which, of course, you know is the key to setting your Medicaid rebate liability. It's the key to setting your 340B pricing. And only with the passage of the DRA and the final rule that came out in about 2007 did we have some handle on what AMP was really supposed to be. Some consistency then grew out of that, manufacturer to manufacturer, over what AMP was really meant. With the Affordable Care Act and with healthcare reform, very significant changes were written into the rules at a statutory level on AMP. And these include raising the minimum rebate amount for innovator products by 50% from 15.1 to 23.1%. That doesn't specifically have to do with AMP, but it's one of the big drivers in the reasons that manufacturers are facing more Medicaid rebate liability today than ever before. The changes to AMP were themselves spectacular and unforeseen. In the past, we've only had one AMP. You know, prior to 2010, there was one AMP calculation for every product. Well, now we have these two methods for calculating AMP. There's 5i AMP and there's standard AMP or non-5i AMP. Now, a feature about AMP that should not go unnoticed is the fact that since 2007, more and more emphasis has been placed on AMP not as a rebate setting metric, but as a reimbursement setting metric. This is because Congress decided to base its federal upper limit payments for multiple source drugs on a multiple of a common AMP for each group of multiple source drugs. But what you see is you have competing interests at heart now with regard to AMP. Leaving aside the 5i AMP, non-5 AMP issue, you have some people out there who want to see those AMPs as high as possible. These are your chain drugstores, these are your dispensaries. Therefore, what discounts are to be included in AMP should be limited. On the other hand, you have the manufacturers for whom a high AMP is a costly thing. The higher the AMP, the higher their Medicaid rebate liability. So for them, there's an interest in seeing an AMP that is lower. On the one hand, if AMP is low, then their reimbursements to dispensaries will be low. But if AMP is high, their rebates from drug manufacturers will be high. And it will be interesting to see how this tension in the existence of AMP plays out over time. Of course, what manufacturers have to pay close attention to in the calculation of 5i AMP has to do with whether or not the products are generally dispensed to retail community pharmacies. The problem is that it could create a situation where there are drugs that are injected, infused, instilled, implanted, that are 5i drugs but don't qualify for the 5i calculation. And this is because they don't meet the threshold for not generally dispensed. Now, the real problem are those drugs that bounce back and forth. If you have a mix of purchasers, some of whom are RCPs, some of whom are non-RCPs, depending on where that threshold is set, you may be reporting AMP under a different methodology month to month. And then what do you do with the quarterly? And what do you do with the baseline AMP? It could be a real mess. AMP in a post-PPACA world also has an interesting feature that a lot of people aren't talking about, and that is that, in my opinion, those AMPs can include sales by a primary manufacturer to a secondary manufacturer of an authorized generic. Traditionally, those sales had only been included in best price. But the great value to manufacturers with AG relationships is that they could significantly lower their AMPs and their Medicaid rebate liability as a result. So if one of your clients or someone who's watching this hasn't given thought to incorporating authorized generic sales into their own AMPs, they really should.